Welcome to the ATA Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Baird, and you're listening to Inside Specialization, our series on the what, why, and how of specializing in a specific field of translation or interpreting. In each episode, members of ATA's Professional Development Committee will interview translation and interpreting specialists. They'll ask about what the work entails, what skills are needed, the pros and cons, and so much more. The goal is to showcase the variety of career paths in translation and interpreting and help working professionals and students understand what's out there, how they can get started, and what they need to succeed. Specialization is arguably the best way to strengthen your translation and interpreting business and stand out from the crowd. We're hoping to bring you one episode a month, and we hope you'll join us on this informative journey. This podcast is brought to you by the American Translators Association. If you'd like to know more about ATA, we'll have some information at the end of the show. All right, now over to the PD Committee and this edition of Inside Specialization.
Hi, and welcome to the latest edition of ATA's Inside Specialization podcast series, a special collaboration between the ATA podcast and ATA's Professional Development Program. My name is Gloria Cabrejos, and I am a member of ATA's Professional Development Committee. We are thrilled to share this new episode with you, in which we delve into editing, proofreading, and copyediting. In this episode, I have with me special guest Eve Bodeux. Eve is a 25-year veteran of the language industry and an ATA certified French to English translator. She is an enthusiastic editor and has presented in numerous forums on the process of editing. She co-hosted the long-running Speaking of Translation podcast and is the author of Maintaining Your Second Language. She sponsors the Global Reads Book Club for translators. She holds graduate degrees from both the Université de Lorraine in France and the University of Virginia in the US. She serves on the ATA Board of Directors, period 2018-2024. Welcome, Eve.
Thank you, Gloria. It's nice to be here.
Could you describe your background and tell us how you got started as an editor, proofreader, and copy editor?
Yes. Before I became involved in translation as a profession, I was always one of the people, kind of the target person that people would come to with style or grammar questions. And I've always been really into French language grammar and also English language grammar, kind of standing out as a grammar nerd, even in college. And as a translator, I found my editing voice working with colleagues on different projects where I became more aware of my skill as an editor. Because, sometimes like we'll trade, you'll say, oh, we're working on a project and someone will translate and someone will edit. And I kind of became more comfortable in my skin as an editor and realized my passion for editing. And as the years have gone by, this has been recognized by clients and colleagues. And on the professional side, I've also been a member of ACES, and people might want to note this down, and I have a couple resources to provide and share, and perhaps those can go in the show notes at the end. So I've been a member of ACES, which is the Society for Editing in the US, and the website is aceseditors.org.
Oh, well, really interesting journey. And now, some people may think that editing, proofreading, and copy editing are the same. Could you briefly explain how they differ?
Sure. I don't know if it's brief, but I think it's pretty interesting information that I have to share with the listeners on editing, proofreading, and copy editing about those definitions. So first, I wanted to address and define editing specifically within the confines of our industry, because there are lots of different ways kind of approaching that. But of course, here today in this podcast, we want to talk about specifically editing within our perspective, right, in the translation industry. So how is editing related to the task of translation specifically? So first, I wanted to refer to Brian Mossop's book. It's called Editing and Revising for Translators. And I think that's a really good place to go for a definition that's related to our specific task at hand, editing in the terms of translation. And actually, Mossop, the author, prefers the term revision to the term editing. Mm-hmm. And I think he prefers that among other reasons. He wants to avoid confusion between discussing the relationship between editors and like monolingual writers, so maybe like in the publishing industry, and those between translators and editors, or those who revise translation work. So that kind of helps to do that by using the term revision. So he defines revision and what we in the American translation industry call editing, and what we are calling editing in this podcast. He defines that as reading a translation in order to spot problematic passages and then making or recommending any corrections or improvements that are needed to meet a certain standard of quality. A source text in another language is always available for consultation. So then he adds this next part, which I really like. The purpose of revision is to make changes. It's to notice problems. So I really like that, because I see the task of editing as helping to create a more perfect translation. So even the best translators' work can use editing, right?
Right.
And it's important to keep that purpose in editing in mind. The purpose is to create a high quality translation product. So that's what I really enjoy about editing, making positive changes to a work that improve its quality. And so my goal, and that's what everyone's goal should be, I think, in doing this type of editing, is to do that. And it's never to just bring down the translator. The goal is to improve the quality of the work at hand. So as that author, as Mossop says, for the task of editing, I think within the bigger picture of translation, an individual needs to have professional knowledge of both languages involved. Like he said, you're always going to be referring back to the source text. So of course, you naturally need to understand both languages. And I saw something really interesting. Maybe you saw this too, Gloria, recently on the ATA Business Practices discussion group. There was a topic called working in a language you don't know.
Oh,
Which
interesting.
was an intriguing discussion. So some people in there, they were talking about, you can edit a translation, whether it's from a human or machine translation, without knowing one of the languages involved, which I've heard that over the years too. Someone talked about once, years ago, I heard someone talking about translating poetry and not knowing the language. And I thought, what are they talking about?
Yeah, really.
but whatever, people have different ideas. But if people want to look that up too, it was on the ATA Business Practices discussion group. And the topic again was working in a language you don't know. But I am not of that opinion. I think you definitely need to know both languages involved to be a good editor in this industry, and to know them very well. And then also one thing I wanted to add lastly about editing was you should also ideally have subject matter expertise of the content that you're editing. So invariably issues will arise about terminology, terms of art, or other subject matter specific questions. And so an editor who does not possess the proper subject matter expertise obviously can inadvertently insert errors when they lack the awareness of different terminology or different style used in a certain field of knowledge. So yeah, that's what I had to say on editing. So do you have any questions, or should we just go on to what I think is proofreading?
No. Please go ahead with proofreading and copy editing.
Okay, yeah. So what is proofreading? So I gave a presentation on proofreading actually with my colleague Emily Safran at last year's ATA conference in Minneapolis. That was in 2021. And in that presentation, we actually did give a specific definition of proofreading, and that's what I'm going to discuss with you guys here today. So proofreading from a technical proofreading from a technical standpoint refers to reviewing copy that has been prepared for printing, or what is the process of what we call typesetting. So that's the review of the proof. So it's like it's ready to be proofed. It's like this final copy that's going to be reproduced, right?
Yes.
So it would happen after editing is complete. So the purpose of it is to catch errors in the text or in design issues that have been introduced during the process of preparing it for print, whichever today it may be hard copy or it could be on electronic or whatever. So, and actually in translation, proofreading can take place before the content has been put into its final form. So for example, a text could go through a proofreading stage while it's still inside a CAT tool, where the proofreader has access to both source and target segments, but it hasn't been laid out yet into its final form, which would be like, say, a book or a document or a brochure, that type of thing. And then in translation, proofreading could and should also take place after the content has been put into its final form. It's this again, such as like a sales brochure, a business document, report, a website, or whatever, because you're going to be able to catch different types of errors. And in the final, you want it to go through. But often I feel myself convincing clients, especially when I am running projects for other languages than my own, because I do that a lot of project management too. Like convincing clients to, yes, you need a proofread at the very final stage, because often, as we know, there'll be someone maybe who does the desktop publishing task, or who does that last task, who doesn't speak the language, who may be someone who does a lot of multilingual desktop publishing, but they don't speak the languages they're working with. And so it needs to be looked at in that final form too.
Yes. And what about copy editing?
Copy editing is, I think, somewhat of a confusing term, because it's used in monolingual professional writing too, that nothing to do with translation, but just like straight English writing, for example. And then it could mean things like, checking for and correcting inadvertent errors in grammar, things that we're talking about here, or whatever. Just kind of the similar term to similar topics that would cover proofreading, I think, in a translation environment. Maybe that in a monolingual environment, they would call it copy editing, but in the translation environment, we call it proofreading. And so also copy editing in English also refers specifically to writing for marketing or advertising purposes. So that's a little bit of a confusing term, because it means these two things. So even for the definition alone of doing it for writing purposes, there's different perspectives on that. And so I wanted to recommend to the listeners, I subscribe to Advertising Copy X, really interesting takes on this type of copy editing, which is not what we're talking about today, but it's still an interesting resource. And so I wanted to provide a link in the show notes to a video talking about what is copywriting. So I'll provide that to you, Gloria, afterward.
Okay. Eve, thank you for clearly explaining these terms. And now, what are some specific editing, proofreading, copy editing projects you generally work on?
Yeah, I would say that types of projects vary according to the client and the industry and specific project. But basically, editing, proofreading, copy editing apply for pretty much every project that we might come across. So just to have some examples of things that I've worked on, and I'm sure our listeners do too, I've proofread live websites that were just created in English, that were monolingual only. I've also edited website content translated from French into English, documents, brochures, content for online courses. I had a client who I did tons of lease agreements for. I proofread those, insurance documents, human resources documents, content for videos, tourism content, international development documents, product labels, instruction manuals, literary text, right? 20 plus years of editing and proofreading, I've seen a lot of projects, but that just gives us the example of really, these are very basic tasks that can basically be applied right to any kind of project.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Also, what specific skills are needed to specialize as editors, proofreaders, or copy editors? Do you think that is it necessary to be a professional writer?
I do think that editing takes a specific skill set. So you could have the skills to be both a writer or a translator in our case, and an editor, but not necessarily. So editing really is a different but related skill set to translation. And as I noted earlier, of course, the first basic thing is that you need to know both languages, right? So we just take that as given. And I do mean at the professional translation level, not just business communication level. So it's different. Like people say, just because you can communicate in the business world in two languages doesn't necessarily mean you'd be a good translator / editor, right? So I think one of the important things at first is that a good editor actually likes the task of editing. And I say that because if you're only taking editing jobs because they were offered to you or because you need some additional work, you may not turn out to be actually that great at the task of editing. And so I know just kind of over the years, you hear sometimes people dread editing. They dread editing a colleague's work or dread editing a translator's work they don't know, and they feel it's a really burdensome task. And so that can be true, of course, if a translated text is of poor quality. But actually, I've been pleasantly surprised how much people kind of in our industry kind of complain about that possibility. I find it not to be the case very often. I feel that if you're being offered editing work just to fix poor quality work, if you suspect that or think that, then turn it down, because you want to focus on editing good translations that your editing makes even better. So
Yeah.
Another thing um, that a good editor needs to be concerned with is really you need to like the nitty-gritty details. You need to like looking at each word, each phrase, each paragraph, and then how does all that fit together as a whole. So you're looking at things like, really fine grammar points. What about consistency throughout the whole document? So you want to make sure that the translation doesn't just read well, like you do want it to read well, but you also want to make sure that accurately reflects the source text and style and meaning. So you have to be someone who really likes nitty gritty details. Another thing is you want to be able to give reasons, like give sound reasons for every change that you make to a text. So for me, like, for example, like, well, it sounded better. That's not a sound reason.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The reasons should be based on like stylistic concerns, terminology, consistency, or other reasons that have that foundation in fact. So often like when I'm editing a text and I might think to myself, oh, I personally would have approached that differently. I would have looked at it differently, but that does not mean that the text I'm editing is not correct. It just means I personally, if I'd started it from scratch, would have done it differently, but it doesn't mean that it's not right. So I want to go back to what I said earlier about the author Mossop, who wrote the book on editing and revising. And remember that he said the purpose of revision is not to make changes. So we're not just like, oh, goody, I got to make all these changes.
Yeah.
It's to specifically notice problems. And we don't want to make changes unless there are actually problems. So, and the last thing I wanted to say about being a good editor is that a good editor is also a good researcher and likes to research to resolve basically outstanding issues or questions about a text or subject that are going to invariably come up. So you don't want to just do it out of your head. You can't be kind of, lazy in that sense. You have to take the time to do the research to back up what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you. Thank you for this great advice. And tell us, what tools, technology, or resources would you recommend for working on an editing, proofreading, or copy editing assignment?
Yeah, so the first and foremost, the most important tools we have in editing and proofreading are our eyes and our brain, of course. The kind of the human task, the human part of it. But there are some tools that can help with editing and proofreading. So some basic tools, of course, would just include using words review tools, like if you're editing in MS Word, which is pretty common. You can look for kind of an automated fashion of looking at spelling, looking at grammar, looking at various punctuation. So this just gives us a first pass. And often, as people will often reject suggestions that the program makes because we think, well, no, actually, in this case, sometimes the suggestions that MS Word would make are pretty simplistic and they might be wrong for what we're doing. But so we want to use our human brain and reject those. We don't just think, oh, the computer told us this, But on the other hand, they're going to pick up some items that we've missed as we do with our eyes. Oh, I didn't see that there was a space before that comma or things like that. So we do also want to take that pass.
Well, yeah, excellent pointers, Eve. And what are the typical clients and the major industries that request these services?
Yeah, I think, like I said before, editing and proofreading are really needed for all types of clients in all industries. It's just like basic tasks. So they're fundamental tasks in the process of creating high quality translation content.
Oh, yeah, interesting. And what are some useful strategies or techniques for effective editing, proofreading, and copy editing?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I mentioned earlier that we can proofread in or edit in Word, but also obviously a lot of us will be proofreading or editing in a computer-aided translation tool. And so one thing you can do, again, kind of related to my tip on Word, is you can run the built-in QA tools to see what it alerts you to. And then again, use your human brain to decide if these are actually applicable or not, but it helps us to get, more insight into a text by using some of the automated tools.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing we can do is, especially for using MS Word, is we can use the read aloud function. And that is a feature where you can have it read to you the text. And I think this is particularly useful if you're editing your own work, but also when you're editing other people's work. So hearing a text instead of visual. So you're going to read it, of course, with your eyes, but you're also hearing it then. And that's going to make you aware of various issues that you might have missed when you're just looking at the text. So that's a good tip too. And then also, you want to have different resources at your disposal. So different style guides or usage guides for your language are also important. And that could be electronic, it could be in hard copy, it could be a standard one out in the market, or it could be a house style guide, for example. But like an example of a style guide is the Chicago Manual of Style. Mm-hmm. And an example of a usage guide, I'm giving you a French one since my other language is French, is, for example, it's called Le Bon Usage it's a famous book by Maurice Grevis. And then in English, we have an example of a usage guide is Garner's Modern English Usage. And in fact, I was looking at that. I own a copy. I own the quote newest copy for now, but I found out last night when I was researching for the podcast that the newest edition of the Garner's Modern English Usage is going to come out this year in November 2022. And then the last tool that I wanted to recommend, especially for into English translators, but we think it also does work for like Spanish and Italian and French, is a software tool called Perfectit. And the website for that is intelligentediting.com. And the Perfectit software, the developer calls it proofreading software for professionals. And so it's, I don't know, $70 or $90 a year. And it really helps you to find things like inconsistencies or, inconsistent terminology, just different things, especially in large text that you probably wouldn't notice even if you were manually looking for it. It'll help you find things that you wouldn't have found just with your own eyes.
Well, if really good stuff, our listeners will definitely want to start using those tips, these strategies. And to finish this interview, is there anything else you would like to tell translators who are thinking about specializing in editing, proofreading, and or copy editing?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really love editing and proofreading, and I think they can be a very rewarding way to contribute to translation as a whole. And good editing and proofreading, like I said, can turn a good translation product into a really excellent translation product. So if you feel drawn to editing or proofreading, test out a few projects and then ask for feedback. And also there's some really great classes out there on editing for translation. They're offered by different people who offer continuing education in our industry. Read articles on it, or read interesting books. I gave you guys some references for that, for resources on the process. And I'm interested. If people can reach out to me and let me know how it goes.
Oh, thank you so much, Eve, for your time and for letting us learn more about what you specialize in. I'm sure that our listeners will find your advice and insights helpful and inspiring.
Thank you, Gloria, for inviting me.
Thank you, Eve.
You've been listening to Inside Specialization, our series on the what, why, and how of specializing in a specific field of translation or interpreting. Big thanks to everyone involved in the production of this episode. ATA's PD committee developed and coordinated the interview. Mixing and editing was done by Derek Platts. Mary David and Rashawn Paccarel at ATA headquarters provided editorial and technical support. Now, if you learned anything new in today's podcast, I bet there's somebody out there who would like to know it too. Don't be stingy. Tell them about us. I've gotten to know so many great podcasts that way. I promise they'll thank you for it. And if you're not an ATA member, listen up. I've been a member for over 20 years. I can honestly say that ATA launched my freelance career, and I've never looked back. Nowadays, the demand for translators and interpreters is at an all-time high, but finding quality work isn't easy. ATA membership can make a difference. And ATA isn't just for translators or interpreters. Individuals, companies, and organizations can become members. We have teachers, professors, hospital administrators, language company owners, technology developers, as well as language companies, universities, hospitals, and government agencies. Go to ATA's website, atanet.org, for details. Or check out past episodes of this podcast where we talk about the benefits of membership and what's currently happening in the association. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Talk to you again soon.